welcome to Footprints of Pacifica. My name is Dave Herzl, and I'm happy to welcome you to the 101st episode of this, put on by the Pacifica Historical Society and Channel 26 right here in Pacifica. We're very fortunate this evening to have Miss Joanne Simonis to join us here to tell us something about the shipwrecks along the San Mateo County coast. Joanne, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, Dave, I boarded my first ship actually at age 3. It was a military transport ship called the E.D. Patrick, and we traveled from San Francisco to Yokohama. That was very memorable for me, and ever since then I love stories about the sea and about ships.
Did you travel by sea subsequent to that?
Oh, absolutely. I traveled back once again 3 years later. And then as I've gotten into my research over time, I've been aboard many different kinds of vessels, as many as I can be.
Well, you've got a book here that you're introducing to us, your book, The Hard Luck Coast.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that and how in particular that came to be.
Well, Hard Luck Coast is my second book in a trilogy that I'm writing about shipwrecks at lighthouses along the San Mateo County coast. The first book was about Pigeon Point and Año Nuevo. Hard Luck, and that was called Shipwrecks, Scallywags, and Scavengers. The second book is Hard Luck Coast, which covers shipwrecks at Point Montera and Half Moon Bay. And the third one that I'm currently working on is Point Sur.
Oh, so you're going to head back south again. And
go back south.
And kind of turn that up. Well, tell us a little, well, since we're starting kind of at the south, in the southern end of things and working our way up, tell us, why don't you start with the carrier pigeon down at Pigeon Point?
Well, as a little backdrop, what I'd like to mention is the gold rush.
Okay.
And just a little background in terms of why shipwrecks were so important to the area. The gold rush of 1848, of course, was very much a maritime event, and many more people came by sea than they did overland. This created what was called the Maritime West, which sprouted with multitudes of maritime industries. Now, with all that prosperity also came some difficulties. With the increased numbers of ships also came increased shipwrecks. So the earliest recorded shipwrecks are in the 1850s. The carrier pigeon at Pigeon Point was a beautiful clipper ship. It was on her maiden voyage from Boston to San Francisco when she wrecked at Pigeon Point. And what occurred there is that scavengers descended upon the ship. They took as much as they could from the ship, including food, stripped the ship. And the rest of the story is very interesting because 2 salvage ships came down to also take cargo, salvage whatever cargo they could. And what happened is that one of them wrecked as well. And so now we had 2 shipwrecks in the area. Then they couldn't agree on salvage rights. A third ship came down, and this was captained by Robert Bully Waterman. And Waterman had a very notorious history as a brutal ship's captain. Now, there was debate about that, but his reputation also hindered the salvage process. But in any case, things were finally resolved. And what happened is that Pigeon Point received its name from the carrier pigeon. Prior to these events, which were so memorable, the area was called Whale Point because it was a whaling station. Mm-hmm. So this event named that place. We also, in the 1850s, had at Point Montera, closer to home, we had the Isabelita Hine. And this was a ship that came from the Orient. It was carrying exotic goods from Hong Kong. She wrecked, and when she did, there were all kinds of rumors about mutiny aboard ship and murder of the ship's captain and the first mate. Eventually, it turned out that the captain fell ill, and so obviously he wasn't able to manage surviving through a shipwreck. And the greedy first mate sank because he jumped off ship wearing his money belt. So those are the earliest shipwrecks that we know about in this area.
So it kind of sounds as though we have shipwrecks, but also we have tales of salvage and scavengers.
Absolutely.
And also I think this is also going to become a tale of lighthouses
Yes.
and rescue and life-saving.
Ultimately, yes.
I've always been interested in the Sir John Franklin that wrecked down there.
Yes.
What can you tell me about that?
Probably lots more than we have time for today, but it wrecked in the 1860s. And the Sir John Franklin, again, was a clipper ship. It wrecked at Pigeon Point. Many people were killed in the wreck, unfortunately, including a 16-year-old boy. As you know, many young men went to sea early, as early as the age of 12. And so to me, part of the story of the Sir John Franklin is the story about the hardships that many sailors endured taking these long voyages. 4 of the sailors were buried in the area. Around 1980, actually their coffins were uncovered by a storm, and the remains were reburied, and subsequently there was a walkway that was put over the graves so they wouldn't be further disturbed. So you can still go to that place, imagine what it was like when they wrecked there, and that place now also is called Franklin Point.
I think we have one of the real interesting stories that I ran into as I was reading your book that I thought was for a story that takes place in a shipwreck is rather a charming story. The story of the toy wreck in the Aculio.
Aculio, correct. Well, the Aculio was a British sailing ship, and we'll put up this poster to show you. This is a rendering by artist Galen Wolfe of the wreck of the Aculio, and he called it the toy ship. And the story there is it had a very personal meaning for Galen Wolfe. The story there is that after the Aculio wrecked at Point Montera, all of the cargo was out on the beach, and much of it, because it was late in the year that this ship was sailing, much of it consisted of Christmas toys. So they were gathering up what they could of the toys. The story is that Captain McKay went down, grabbed up a china doll, and in fact gave it to the first little girl that he saw. Well, it turns out, you'll see that the doll is represented down in this corner. It turns out that the little girl that he gave the doll to was actually Galen Wolfe's mother. So we have a lot of very rich coastal history here.
Let's move north a little bit here. Well, actually, tell us a little about the establishment of the fog signals and the lighthouses.
Right. Again, in the 1860s and 70s, there were several other shipwrecks, including the Coya and Hellespont. And this is in terms of the establishment of Pigeon Point Lighthouse. And these were colliers that were carrying coal from Australia. They wrecked within 2 years of each other. 37 people died, and there was a huge hue and cry. Much of it led by the editor of the San Mateo, what was then the San Mateo County Gazette, and his name was H.A. Schofield. And he kept urging the public to put pressure on the lighthouse and on civic officials, or the lighthouse board and on civic officials to create a lighthouse in the area. Now, at the same time, other shipwrecks, such as the Aculio and also the Colorado, which was a floating palace, they called it, a huge Pacific Mail steamship that, by the way, was the first Western liner to carry mail as well as passengers from San Francisco to the Orient. So again, a very historic ship. All of these things happened during the same period. Finally, in 1871, a fog signal was established at Pigeon Point. The next year, a lighthouse was established there. In 1875, a fog signal was placed at Point Montera, but it wasn't until 1900 that the first lighthouse was placed there. And it was merely a lantern that was a little red lantern that was stuck on a stick out on the point. Years later, they erected what they call a skeleton tower, so it looked very much like, very stick-like and very short tower. And then in 1928, the current tower, which is a cast iron tower, was erected. But the significance of that tower, by the way, Dave, is only known recently, within the past 2 years. What researchers discovered is that it was taken from Mayo's Beach in Cape Cod and transported out here to Point Montera. And they don't know how it was transported, whether it was by rail, by sea, but it was brought out here and erected at Point Montera. So our little lighthouse out here is one of a kind in this country. It is the only one to have served on both coasts and the only one to have witnessed shipwrecks on both coasts.
So that's our little Montera light out there.
That's our little gem.
And we left the poor people of Mayo Point on Cape Cod without a lighthouse.
No, they erected a new one.
A newer, nicer one. And because in the book I was reading that the fog signals themselves, that each lighthouse has a different flash period, so it's recognizable, and each one has a different sound of fog signal.
Right.
And there was one of the stories I recall where, and we don't know if the captain was lying or not, but he thought he was at Point Bonita, but he could not possibly have been. Would you?
Yes, actually that happened more than once, many times, and this happened up and down the coast as well, but particularly at Point Montera, because it is the last place to turn into the Golden Gate corridor. Oftentimes that signal would be mistaken for Point Bonita. And as you say, it's strange because there is each fog signal has its own distinct sound. Each lighthouse has its own distinct flash characteristic. But when you're talking about sailing through fog and gales and rough weather and currents that actually carry the ships close to shore, perhaps sometimes you hear what you want to hear or see what you want to see. So a lot of human error is involved in these shipwrecks as well.
Well, Colorado, the ship Colorado gave its name to the reef off
Yes.
from that's just outside of Montera Light, but it was
That's
not
correct.
the only ship to have found that reef, in spite of the fact that there were lighthouses and fog signals.
That's absolutely correct. Even after the lighthouses and the fog signals were erected, many ships came to grief along these shores. And what was always interesting to me is the types of maritime commerce that those ships represent. We have several examples of that, and for instance, just let's start with general cargo ships, such as the Rydal Hall, and I know you're interested in that because in the 1970s they actually were able to resurrect much of what was left of the ship. They had cannons, the ship's bell, but what happened there is that once it wrecked, again, and it was carrying coal, many people swooped down, they were picking up coal, and one individual picked up an old sea chest. His name was Chico Gonzalez. And I met his great-great-grandson, and John Gonzalez Jr. And what John told me is that his dad, it was handed down through the family, and his dad carried that old sea chest around with him everywhere, in the Navy and everywhere else. And eventually, ironically, he took it with him to Point Montera Lighthouse because he became a keeper at Point Montera. So again, a lot of local history, and right back where they originally found it.
So you've seen that sea chest then?
Oh yes, I touched it. I actually touched it. It was a thrill. It was a thrill.
What about the Alice Buck?
Yes, this is another one where we'll show a rendering of the other rendering by Galen Wolfe. Again, the Alice Buck wrecked at Point Montera in the 1800s, and it was a terrible wreck. Many people died, and again, years later in the 1970s, or 1950s actually, Galen Wolfe painted a rendering of that wreck, and he called it The Wreck. And it also had very personal meaning to him because part of the rescue crew included his uncle. So that's how we come to have these beautiful pieces of artwork. The stories about these wrecks were handed down to Galen from his grandfather, and he also, Galen himself, visited his grandparents on this coast very, very frequently. So he's very familiar with the lore of the area.
Now we have one of the spectacular
Yes.
tall shipwrecks that happened right in Half Moon Bay.
I love this story. It's one of the best ones I think that we have. This is the New York, actually the former T.F. Oaks. And this was a beautiful, beautiful ship. You can see by its rigging, it's just has gorgeous lines. It was just fantastic ship. It was also one of the most notorious ships ever to sail. It was one of only 3 full-rigged iron sailing ships ever built in this country. And it also had a terrible sailing record. It was slow. I think it held records for the slowest voyages on the planet at the time. So it had a very bad sailing record. And more than that, it was also what was called a red record ship. And in the late 1800s, the Coast Seamen's Union developed a list of cases aboard ships where there was brutality and cruelty. And this ship was mentioned more than once over the years that it sailed. And even after its name was changed to the New York, it didn't change its sailing luck. Obviously, it wrecked here in Half Moon Bay, sank in 20 feet of sand, and you can see the before and after pictures are so dramatic. I love this. And there was one statement that one of the sailors made that he was so happy that it had wrecked because it was such a terrible ship. And many people were quite cheerful after it went down.
The red record in particular is a very interesting and tragic part of our maritime history.
Yes.
And I've read copies of it myself. And the mates and the captains of the ships, in the supposed interest of maintaining discipline, felt free to really brutalize and beat and occasionally murder their seamen in order to maintain discipline. This is all well documented in the red record.
Yes.
Now we have, what have we here?
We have another shipwreck very close to where the New York wrecked, and this is called the City of Florence. What I liked about this is it demonstrates, this is an old newspaper, the front page of an old newspaper, and you can see another stout ship lays her bones on Montera Reef. I mean, these shipwrecks were very big deals, when it happened, and they happened so close to shore as well. The City of Florence was carrying coal. She was an older ship, but was under the command of a Captain Leask for most of her sailing history. Now, he retired shortly before this wreck happened, and he really lamented leaving the ship. But he prophesied, he said, poor old Florence, because of her age, poor old Florence, it won't be long now. Well, the very next year, she wrecked at Half Moon Bay.
And the New York and the Florence here, both of them wrecked essentially right on the beach, right in full view of Half Moon Bay.
Absolutely.
And it was kind of an occasion, like a social occasion, for people to go down and visit the shipwreck.
Yes, they would picnic down there after they scavenged what they could. They would picnic. Early scavengers even used shovels for frying pans and fried up food on the beach. So it was a long history of that sort of thing.
Let's take a quick look at the wire loading in the dog holes.
Absolutely. Lumber is another maritime commerce here, very, very important to the coast, as you know. And the Argonaut was an example of one of these dog hole schooners. And I might explain that dog hole port comes from the small little inlets all along the coast. And it was given that name because, according to old sailors, there was hardly enough room for a dog to crawl in, turn around, and come out again. And that's exactly right. If you look at those little corners that the ships came into, there were no piers, no wharfs. They had to actually back in, if you will, to the coves. And then the way that they transferred lumber and other products, and I think we have a photograph even showing people being transferred, is called loading by wire. There would be a pike or a derrick or a winch on shore. The wire would be run down to the ship, and oftentimes it was attached to the mast of the ship, and then they would send this load up and down in a little seat type thing, up and down to the ship very dangerous operation.
Well, another of our famed coastal enterprises was rum running.
Yes, indeed. Rum running was very popular, of course, during Prohibition, during the 1920s, 1930s. The Pilgrim was one of those ships at Pigeon Point, and Grays Harbor was another one here at Point Montera. And the story about the Pilgrim is that they were actually using, they came in more than once, and the keeper's daughter would watch from the tower. She would look down on moonlit nights and be able to watch the operations. And one night, the rum runners even took the keeper, his name was Jesse Migrants, away at gunpoint, forced him into the Model T and down the coast to help them deliver their goods because the ship had wrecked.
Well, we had I lived in Moss Beach. We have our Moss Beach distillery, and right here in Pacifica, we have the castle that have their own bits of history of rum running. What about fishing?
Fishing is another huge one. Fishing is an industry that was important, just as important today, of course, as it was in the past. Sardines, salmon, all kinds of fish, but there are two ships, just as an example, the Western Spirit and the Ohio No. 3, and they both wrecked at Pigeon Point. They were both part of Monterey's famous sardine fleet. They wrecked during storms, and the story with the Western Spirit is the keeper, Gerhard Janey, saw the distress, or heard the distress signals, ran down just carrying a lantern, and by the light of the lantern and the beam from the lighthouse, he rescued 11 fishermen by throwing a line aboard the ship. So he was a real-life hero. And then the Ohio No. 3, also what they called a purse seiner, and by this I mean these are the kinds of ships that had a huge net that they would throw out, circle the fish, and then pull it aboard the ship, and you would, and the fishermen on board would be drenched in fish and salt water. So it was a very nasty business, but it was a very necessary one. And that purse seiner was actually the first Japanese-owned purse seiner in Monterey's fleet. So another historic vessel.
And then we've had some military shipwrecks right here also.
Absolutely. The DeLong is a good example. The USS DeLong wrecked here in 1921. And it came very, very close to shore, just about ran directly into the cliffs, as you see on the image here. But it was in a position on the reef where they couldn't launch lifeboats to rescue the crew. And it was also in close enough on the reef that they couldn't bring rescue vessels in to take the crew off. So they used what's called a breeches buoy, which is essentially a lifesaver with pair of rubber pants attached. They throw a line out to the ship, and they bring the crew in one by one by one. And this was a huge crew aboard this ship. So that was an example of one, and we have a couple of other very unusual ones. There was the YP 636 in Point Montera, and this was what they call a yard patrol boat, and they had a nickname. They called them Yippies. They were just little vessels, but they did a lot of valuable work. Well, this vessel was when it wrecked at Point Montera, was delivering radioactive fish samples from atom bomb tests in the Bikini Atoll, and these were to be studied at Stanford. Well, they never reached their destination, but of course, everything was ruled off. You know, they cordoned off the area. People thought, oh my gosh, radiation was going to spread. Of course, it didn't. The fish were dead. They were underwater, but so there was no damage. But that was a very unusual cargo to be arriving here. And also, another unusual vessel, it was an experimental barge amphibious resupply cargo craft, BARC for short. That's what they called it, the BARC. And this was an amphibious vessel that was designed by the U.S. Army to deliver goods and men and machinery. It could carry a locomotive, it was so large, into ports where there were no piers. This particular vessel was being towed by an Army tug to San Francisco for demonstration purposes, and the tug went too fast, towed it under the water, and actually 3 people were killed. So that was very unfortunate.
So the action of the tug actually drew it beneath the waves.
Beneath the waves. The good news is that these amphibious vessels were later used very extensively in the Arctic, in Europe, and in Vietnam.
That's a little bit there that was news for me.
So amazing history.
The up at Hyde Street Pier, we have done a demonstration of the breaches buoy. It's quite, an interesting thing to see. And over time, rescue from shore was pretty important because our reefs are pretty close, and the wrecks would happen right here.
That's right. That's right.
And I believe the life-saving service and the Lighthouse service were combined into the Coast Guard.
Into the Coast Guard, that's correct. I think in the early 1930s, yes, they were absorbed into the Coast Guard.
And now we see the Coast Guard helicopters various times flying up and down the coast along here.
Well, and the most of the lighthouses were in the 1960s were automated. The Coast Guard started what they called the LAMP program, the Lighthouse Automation and Modernization Program. So they took out all of the personnel. They replaced the lenses, or in some cases the lenses are still there, like Pigeon Point. But they placed what they called an aero beacon, an automatic beacon. Same flash characteristic, but replaced those people, and they closed many of the lighthouses during that period.
Have you been to Point Reyes and seen the Fresnel light in operation up there?
Yes, yes, I have.
It's fascinating what human technology can consider.
Yes.
We're getting close to the end of our time. Maybe you could tell us how people might be able to purchase your book, Hard Luck Coast.
Oh, certainly. They're available on my website at www.gullcottagebooks.com. They're also available at Glen Cannon Press. There's an 800 number, 800-711-8985, and also Florence Books in Pacifica. And I'd just like to close, if we have a minute, with the significance of ships and shipwrecks.
Sure.
To me, they're very important portals to the past, and they do illuminate very specific moments in time for us, and I think shed light on who we are and who we've been and who we are. So I'd like to see this, my goal is to see that this history is continued and that the stories of the coast side and the people connected with it are preserved.
Well, thank you. That's about all the time that we have today. I wish we could go on for another hour.
I do
There's
too.
a million things here I'd like to learn. If you would like to learn a little bit more about the Pacifica Historical Society and our many projects, our address here in Pacifica is P.O. Box 752, Pacifica 94044. Or visit us online at www.pacifica.org. Finally, our phone number, 359-5462. We hope to hear from you. Thanks for watching our show, and tune in again next week.